neuroanatomy can be studied and should be studied by very different points of view. Histology, functional, radiological, biochemical, even genomic neuroanatomy. But for all these points of view, you have to start understanding what I call the brain architecture. You have to know where things are. For us neurosurgeons, this brain architecture is much more important. I always say that a neurosurgeon or a neuroradiologist cannot know what a given lesion is, but has to know exactly where it is. And we neurosurgeons have to know how can we get there. And sometimes we have to be creative. We have to go to a different sulcus, to a different fissure. In a glioma, why I like gliomas? Because gliomas are you can be very creative when you operate on gliomas. Aneurysms, very, very interesting, but pretty much the same surgery. Now, every glioblastoma, every GBM is different from the other if you want to do a radical resection. If you do endoscopy, anything, you have to know anatomy. And so you have to know the brain architecture. Now, the other thing for us neurosurgeons is that we have to know a very specific brain architecture. We have to understand the structures related to themselves, and particularly the structures related to the CSF spaces, which are the natural spaces, the natural intracranial spaces. Because when you go into a lesion, we're going to go as much as we can through a natural space, through a CSF space. And the foci, as we're going to be seeing later, they are landmarks for us. And we're going to be using as corridors. So we have to understand the structures in relation to the foci and to the ventricles most. That's what we're going to be talking first. And later today or probably tomorrow, we're going to try to show how we can use these anatomical landmarks to do what I call anatomy-guided neurosurgery. So we're going to start. I'm going to show a little theoretical slides just to make sense about the shape of some structures. And we go. I'm going to sit because I have to look at the screen as you do have. Sorry for my English. Sometimes the words doesn't come, but I hope that the images talk by themselves. Initially, I want to thank Richard. The most beautiful dissection you're going to be seeing here, were done by Richard in Evandro Oliveira's lab where we worked together in Beneficência Portuguesa in São Paulo. I want to also thank Eduardo, my son, who's here. He's going to be giving a lecture about the central core, that project he did with Dr. Roten, and he helps me in the 3D as well. And to start talking about architecture, let me initially emphasize that throughout evolution, the brain, to develop and to increase without a proportional increase of the head and to turn out a huge head, what did nature do? Nature did bend the developing central nervous system around the center. And then in order to develop a bigger surface, it went through an infolding process again towards the center. And these main steps of all these million and million years evolution is repeated in our embryological development, as you know. So this bending and folding mechanisms are very, very important for us to understand the shape of the brain. Now, as you know from embryology, our neurotube developed from a 3-vesicle stage into a 5-vesicle stage. And what I want to emphasize here is that while the inner aspects of this neurotube develop in the ventricular cavities, in the aqueduct, the superficial part, the wall of these tubes developed into the neurostructures. And this took place at the same time that there was this bending and folding mechanisms. So that's why the brain has this C-shaped format, because it was done this way throughout evolution. So when we look at the brain, we all initially have to know that the thalamus is in the center of the brain. The thalamus is both the morphological and functional center of the brain because of this folding mechanism, this bending mechanism, and this enfolding mechanism of the brain surface. And upper ventricle, the upper vesicle, which is the prosencephalic vesicle, gave rise to the lateral ventricles and to the third ventricle that's in between both thalami. Let me just come back here. The upper vesicle, the prosencephalic vesicle, did divide itself into two ventricles. And the lower part of the prosencephalic vesicle developed into the third ventricle in between both thalami that developed from these surfaces of the neural tube. So the thalamus, each thalamus in each hemisphere divides the ventricular cavity. Everything that is anterior to the thalamus is anterior horn or frontal horn. Everything that is superior to the thalamus is the body of the ventricle. Everything that is posterior to the thalamus is the atrium. Everything that is inferior to the thalamus is the temporal horn or inferior horn. The posterior horn or occipital horn is just a posterior extension of the atrium, and it's very variable from person to person. So again, we have to have the thalamus in the center of the brain. So let's build the brain from the thalamus. I would say that the thalamus is a pretty well-defined neurostructure. It's a structure itself, while the hypothalamus is a region that lies underneath both thalami and has a new shape because it's inferior to this thalamus, to the thalamus on our side, and in between them, in the bottom of the U, as we're going to be seeing as the floor of the third ventricle. The optic tract is an extension of the thalamus, as you know, and has to be seen as so. Now, the first thing I want to talk about this architectural feature of the thalamus is that the thalamus is the head of the brainstem. Morphologically, the thalamus, both thalami belong to the brainstem, just like the stem of a tree that has two heads. And there's no fissure, nothing in between the thalamus and the midbrain. So the thalamus is the head of the brainstem. Just to see here, you can see that optic tract, lateral geniculate body, and medial geniculate body, midbrain. The midbrain has the peduncle and the lateral mesencephalic sulcus. The medial geniculate body is always very, very well defined. It's round, it's a prominence, and it's always at the upper aspect of the lateral mesencephalic sulcus. And here you always have a very constant vein that is lateral mesencephalic vein. So in the top of this, you have the lateral mesencephalic, the medial geniculate body. The lateral geniculate body is more anterior, more lateral, more flat. Sometimes you don't even see. It's indeed not just a prominence, it's a region, as we're going to be seeing a little bit later. So, but at this point, what I want to emphasize is that there's no separation, no fissure between the thalamus and the midbrain. So when we come back here, we know that the thalamus is the center of the brain, and the thalamus is the head of the brainstem. And that this tree that is the brainstem itself, it's pretty much in the center of the brain. The first structure we're going to be putting around the thalamus is the so-called hippocampal formation. In order to understand the structures that constitute the hippocampal formation, let's come back again to phylogeny, to evolution. And let's know that the hippocampus was in the top of the very old brainstem. And then it did slip throughout evolution and ended at the bottom of the inferior horn of the temporal horn. Now, when this structure came down, it left a tail. And the tail is the fornix, because as we're going to be seeing, the fornix is the continuation of the amon horn, which is the hippocampus itself. Now, this slipping here took place when the reptiles were turning into mammals. The mammals were developing. And the telencephalon was, both hemispheres were being developed. And with the development of both hemispheres, you had the corpus callosum being developed as well, to put together both hemispheres. So the upper part of the vestigial part of the amon horn of the hippocampus that was left here is the so-called so-called, indusium griseum. The indusium griseum is the vestigial part of the hippocampus that was left superior to the corpus callosum. And of course, since this came down here, you have a continuation between the indusium griseum and the hippocampus itself with other gyri fasciolaris. This is all vestigial structures now. They don't have a very defined function as far as we know. But try to understand at this point that the fornix is the tail of the hippocampus that just came down here. Of course, going around the thalamus as evolution did. So if we come back here, let me just have some water here. The hippocampus is called, it's the amon horn. We call hippocampus the amon horn itself, which is this prominence, together with the dentine nuclei. But we're going to be calling everything hippocampus. Hippocampus has a head, has a body, and has a tail. It's so old structure that the white matter is outside, just like in the brainstem, just like in the cord, the spinal cord. These very old structures have that white matter outside, not inside. And as you know, these are the axons that are going to get together and constitute the fornix. And the fornix has a very flat, a very thin part, which is the fimbrium of the fornix. Then you have the crura, everything that is facing posteriorly in anatomy called crural. So this is the crura of the fornix. It's very flat, as you're going to be seeing better in other slides. And then you have a very round body of the fornix. And then you have the pillar or column of the fornix that will end at the mammillary body. Throughout evolution then came the paleocortex. The paleocortex, since the hippocampus is archicortex, then you have the paleocortex developing. And you have the parahippocampal gyros developing along the hippocampus. That's why altogether this gyrus is called parahippocampal gyrus, because was developed along the hippocampus itself. The superior aspect of the parahippocampal gyrus is the subiculum. And subiculum means bed, means where the thalamus is resting and where the dentate nuclei are resting. While the hippocampus, the amon horn itself, has 3 layers of cortex, the subiculum already has 4 layers of cortex. It's still a paleocortical structure. And just in front of the head of hippocampus, you have the amygdala. As we're going to be emphasizing in many dissections, the amygdala is not only just in front of the head of the hippocampus, but it covers a little bit the head of the hippocampus. So this is altogether parahippocampal gyrus. This is the tail, the fornix is the tail of the hippocampus itself. The dentate nuclei are just medial in between the subiculum and the hippocampus. Here we can see better the parahippocampal gyrus. And we have to understand the parahippocampal gyrus as the stem of a tree that has two main branches. One is the isthmus of the cingulum. We're going to be seeing this better later this afternoon. Isthmus of the cingulum and the lingual gyrus. These are the main components that get together and constitute the parahippocampal gyrus. We're going to be seeing this afternoon that there's a part of the precuneus that also will get here inside the stem of this tree, and also a part of the corpus callosum also that is going to get inside this parahippocampal gyrus. Parahippocampal gyrus is a very complex gyrus. It's a very old gyrus, and it gave rise to other neocortical gyri that came later. Anatomy is a lot of definitions, okay? So you know that this is the calcan fissure. This is calcan fissure. We call parahippocampal gyrus everything that is after the calcan fissure. So this is parahippocampal gyrus. This is isthmus of the cingulate gyre. And the parahippocampal gyrus also always have this always the same constant shape, triangular part with the uncus, with the uncus sulcus inside it. We're going to come back to this region later, the apex of the uncus that harbors the ambient gyrus here. We're going to repeat this in order for you to keep this in mind. Here you have the stem of the tree that I'm talking about. This is the uncus, the uncus sulcus. This is the apex, this is the uncus itself. Some authors call uncus just the superior part, superior to the uncus sulcus. And this inferior part also as belonging to the body of the parahippocampal gyrus. But usually we call all this together all the uncus. This is the apex. In the apex of the uncus, you have inside here, you have the ambient gyrus. And in the uncus, you have the PCA coming here, the more proximal part of the PCA. And then you have the semi-annular sulcus superior to here. And then you have the semi-annular gyrus in here. And you have the anterior choroidal artery going just superior to the PCA here. So you see that the lingual gyrus is very much continuous with the parahippocampal gyrus. The parahippocampal gyrus, indeed, is very much more a continuation of the lingual gyrus and not of the isthmus. But the isthmus, of course, is coming here. And you see how deep the calcaneal fissure is. And of course, this is the precuneus that has a branch that is coming here to get inside the parahippocampal gyrus. This is the splenium, okay, the corpus callosum. You see that also gets inside the parahippocampal gyrus. So very complex gyrus. In this upper part, where the thalamus is resting, is the subiculum. Again, subiculum means bed, and the thalamus is resting in this bed. Then you can see the dentine nuclei, we see them from medial, of course, and the fimbria of the hippocampus, fimbria of the fornix. This is medial, this is lateral, this is anterior, this is posterior, okay? So you see here the head of hippocampus, the body of the hippocampus. You see here the fimbria. This is the alveus. I forgot to tell you that the surface of hippocampus is so white. That's why I call alveus. Alveus in Latin means white. And you here see the dentae gyri, okay? And this is all subiculum, this flat surface where the thalamus is resting, and also where the dentine nuclei are resting. And this sulcus that's in between the dentine nuclei, between the hippocampus itself and the subiculum, is called hippocampal sulcus. This is phylogenetically our first sulcus because it's separating archicortex from paleocortex. So this is first sulcus. Second sulcus we're going to be seeing is the rhinocortex because separates paleocortex from neocortex. When epilepsy surgeons say that they want to reach the hippocampal sulcus, it's because they want to remove not only the A1 horn, but also the dentine nuclei. And both of them together constitute the hippocampus, as I said. Here you see the calcaneal fissure, and here you see the lingual gyrus. Lingual gyrus coming to continue as the parahippocampal gyrus. This is anterior, this is medial, lateral, and posterior. So here we did cut the head of hippocampus, and you can see that, you can almost see that we have 3 layers. And the layers that is more superficial is the alveus, the axons. White matter outside, not inside, just as the cord and the brainstem. Subiculum, hippocampus sulcus. Fimbria, crura. Posterior here already crura. Parahippocampal gyrus. This is all parahippocampal gyrus. What gyrus is lateral to the parahippocampal gyrus? What gyrus is this? Fusiform gyrus. Fusiform gyrus. We're going to be talking very much about the fusiform gyrus. And the sulcus that it's in between both is a very deep sulcus. It's the collateral sulcus. Very old sulcus. Collateral sulcus is so deep that almost reaches the ventricular cavity. If we lift the fimbria, we can see, of course, better the dentine nuclei. This is hippocampal sulcus. This is subiculum. This is all parahippocampal gyrus. So this is on the side, of course, you have both amygdala here. And the fornix, we start with the fimbria, and then you have the crura, and then you have the body of the fornix. And both body of the fornix, they are united along the midline. They are together along the midline, and then they give rise to the pillar of column of the fornix that go to each respective mammillary body. Again, the amygdala, that it's just anterior to the head of the hippocampus, and it covers a little bit the head of hippocampus. The head of the hippocampus always have these 2 or 3 indentations, And it resembles a head. That's why some people call, it resembles a foot, I'm sorry. That's why some people call pes hippocampi, which means the foot of hippocampus. That's another nomenclature, very old nomenclature, because of this indentations here that looks like the foot of a lion, as the old neuroanatomists used to say. But this is head, body, and the tail of the hippocampus. Coming back to our parahippocampal gyrus, to the more anterior part, you have the uncus. Uncus always have this triangular shape, always, with the apex medial. The anterior surface of the uncus is always facing the carotid cistern. You have carotid artery running here, and you're going to have the bifurcation just above the uncus. In the posterior part of this triangle, always facing the peduncle. Always facing the peduncle. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that if we divide this triangle in two parts, the anterior part of the triangle harbors the amygdala, and the posterior part of the triangle harbors the head of hippocampus. Very important. So when you look to this triangular with this triangle, which is the uncus, you have to have in mind that the anterior half is the amygdala, and posterior half is head of hippocampus. So if you have a cavernoma, for example, in the amygdala, you can come transylvian. If you have a cavernoma in the head of the hippocampus, no way of coming transylvian. You're going to have to go transtemporal some way, as we're going to discuss later. We're going to be seeing better other aspects of this dissection later, but at this point, I just want to emphasize that the head of hippocampus, body of hippocampus, and the amygdala covering the anterior part of the head of hippocampus, and also covering the superior aspect of it. It covers a little bit the head of hippocampus. And a very important thing about the amygdala is that superiorly it is continuous with the globus pallidus. We're going to come back to all these dissections. Don't worry about the other structures. But I just want to emphasize now that the amygdala, besides being anterior, this is head. If I show you this, you have to say this is head of hippocampus. Why? Because it's just posterior to the amygdala. Everything that is anterior to the amygdala, to the head of hippocampus, is amygdala. And the amygdala covers a little bit the head of hippocampus, and superior is continuous with the globus pallidus. You see, it's pretty much alike. It's almost the same structure. It's continuous here. That's why epilepsy surgeon says it's not possible to remove completely the amygdala, because we don't even know where it ends. And it's very difficult surgically to go superior to this area here. We're going to be understanding the temporal stem and all the structure of the basal forebrain here later. But at this point, just have in mind that the amygdala is superior with the globus pallidus. This is the anterior commissure in the channel of Gratiolet. We'll come back to this. This is optic radiation. We're going to come back to this. I want to repeat for you to have this in mind. But just keep this connection in mind right now. So again, you have the amygdala and you have the head of hippocampus. And now you know that the amygdala, anterior half of this triangle, which is the uncus, it will be continuous anterior with the globus pallidus. This very dark thing here is the base of the putamen. And this lighter brown here, anterior part, more medial part, is the globus pallidus. Amygdala is continuous with the globus pallidus here. This is all so-called temporal stem. We're going to be coming back to this later. Head of hippocampus, body, tail of hippocampus, fimbria, crura. You see how the crura is flat? And then the body of the fornix that is very volumetric, very cylindric, continues with the pillar or column of the fornix. If this is the head of hippocampus, what is this here? Please? What is this? Someone in the back? What is anterior to the head of hippocampus always? The amygdala. The amygdala. So this is the uncus. This is the anterior half of the uncus, and this is the posterior half of the uncus. The apex of the uncus is going to be medial. This is optic tract, and of course this is thalamus. Well, since the fornix wraps the thalamus, goes around the thalamus, we have to have a fissure in between the thalamus and the fornix. And of course, this fissure is the choroidal fissure. Now, where does the choroidal fissure start? Remember that the amygdala is continuous superior with the globus pallidus. So this anterior half of the uncus is incorporated in the lateral aspect of the basal forebrain. So there's no fissure here. The fissure starts more posterior, pretty much at the level of the head of hippocampus, in a point that is called inferior choroidal point. In this inferior choroidal point, you have the anterior choroidal artery coming here, and you have the inferior ventricular vein coming out. Everything that is anterior to the inferior choroidal point will belong to the so-called temporal stem, because it's incorporated in the lateral aspect of the basal forebrain, having its inner aspect, the upper connection of the amygdala with the globus pallidus. Try to understand this architecture. So, and then the choroidal fissure goes in between the fimbria, between the crura and the thalamus, okay? And then in between the body of the fornix and the anterior part of the thalamus, anterior and superior part of the thalamus. But suddenly, the column of the fornix gets inside the tissue, the brain tissue, inside the parenchyma. When it gets inside, of course, it ends the choroidal fissure. But before getting inside, the body of the fornix detaches from the thalamus and then gets inside the brain tissue. When it gets more superior, it enlarges the choroidal fissure. And what is this enlargement of the choroidal fissure? This enlargement of the choroidal fissure is the foramen Monro, the intraventricular foramen Monro. As you know, we will have here the third ventricle in between this thalamus and the thalamus that will be here. And you know the interventricular foramen Monro is very anterior. And it's in the superior aspect of the third ventricle, but very anterior also. So, understand that the intraventricular foramen Monro is an enlargement of the choroidal fissure. And choroidal fissure starts at an inferior choroidal point and ends at the foramen Monro. This is lateral. Let's see from medial now. From medial, again, seeing the crura. And here you see the body of the fornix. The body of the fornix detaches from the thalamus. This is all thalamus. And then gets inside the tissue here, inside the brain, ending the choroidal fissure. And you have this enlargement of the choroidal fissure here. This is in the roof of the ventricle, of course. We'll come back to this. Enlargement of choroidal fissure is the foramen Monro. That is very anterior and superior within the third ventricle. Now, let's see other things in this dissection also. This is thalamus. You can see that the thalamus, again, is continuous with the midbrain. Of course, this is the aqueduct. And you're going always to be seeing a very deep sulcus that comes from foramen Monro and goes until the opening of the aqueduct. This sulcus, of course, is called hypothalamic sulcus because it's just underneath the thalamus. Hypothalamic sulcus, underneath the thalamus. Goes from foramen Monro to the opening of the aqueduct. So everything that's inferior to this hypothalamic sulcus is hypothalamus. So this is lateral wall of the third ventricle with the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is also part of the lateral wall of the lateral wall of the third ventricle that's in the side of the screen. But we have the thalamus our side, and we have the hypothalamus our side, and then you have the bottom of the U, that it's the floor of the third ventricle. Now, floor of the third ventricle is not only hypothalamus, it's also midbrain. Again, anatomy, lots of definitions. Here seeing the mammillary body. Here seeing the tuber cinereum. We're going to be talking about this later on. Here's the optic chiasm. Anatomy says everything that is anterior to the mammillary body is hypothalamus. Everything that is posterior to the mammillary body is midbrain. So you see that the floor of the third ventricle has a big part here that it's midbrain. And we don't see this in surgery. That's why we never remember this. We only think that the floor of the third ventricle is it's hypothalamus. No, it's also midbrain. This will be the roof of the interpeduncular fossa. But third ventricle will be coming here. You see the aqueduct here? This is all midbrain. This is pineal region. We're going to be coming back to here. So this is just to emphasize that if you have as the anterior aspect of foramen Monro the column of the fornix, and posterior part of the foramen Monro is the anterior thalamic region that harbors the 2 or 3 anterior thalamic tubercles, which harbors the anterior thalamic nuclei. All the anterior thalamic nuclei are within the anterior thalamic tubercle, 3 usually, are just here in the posterior margin of foramen Monro. So next time you look at the foramen Monro coming inside the ventricle, everything that is anterior, fornix, everything that is posterior is the anterior part of the thalamus, exactly where are the anterior thalamic nuclei. Hypothalamic sulcus, hypothalamus, and thalamus, lateral wall of the third ventricle. So now when we come back here, we know that the thalamus is the head of brainstem. We know the thalamus is in the center of the brain. Anterior horn, body of the ventricle, atrium, inferior horn, occipital horn. And you know that everything that is going around the thalamus has to be fornix. So this is the choroidal fissure here. This is choroidal fissure. This is the end of the hippocampus, of the tail hippocampus. This is the body of hippocampus. We're not seeing the head here, it's upper there, or anterior there. This is the body of hippocampus. This is tail of hippocampus. And tail of hippocampus ends at the atrium, at the medial wall of the atrium, as we're going to be seeing. And this is all fornix. This is, of course, the choroidal fissure in between the thalamus and the fornix. And along the choroidal fissure, of course, we have the choroid plexus. So if someone asks you, do we have choroid plexus in the anterior horn? You have to say, no, of course not, because the anterior horn is anterior to the foramen Monro, and the choroidal fissure ends at the foramen Monro. So anterior horn has no choroid plexus. If you open the callosum and you don't see choroid plexus, it's because you are in anterior horn. If you see choroid plexus, it's because you are in the body of the ventricle. The second structure we're going to be putting around the thalamus, this is midbrain, is the caudate nucleus. The caudate also has a head, has a body, and has a tail. Again, here you see the column of the fornix. This is foramen Monro. This is the body of the fornix. This is the crura of the fornix around the pulvinar. I forgot to tell you that the posterior part of the thalamus is called pulvinar. You see the hypothalamic sulcus here. So head of the caudate, body and tail of the caudate. You see the crura of the fornix, how flat it is, choroidal fissure with choroid plexus in the other side, foramen Monro here. Anterior horn has no choroid plexus, okay? While the fornix go around the thalamus medially, the crura of the fornix also always very flat like this, okay? While the fornix goes medially, the caudate wraps the thalamus laterally. And you have the head of the thalamus as the lateral wall of the anterior horn. You have the body of the thalamus as the lateral wall of the atrium, of the body of the ventricle. This is body of the ventricle. This is atrium. I'm emphasizing these architectural features of the brain, and that's why you have to look at this. We're going to come back to this many times. Notice that the anterior horn, the third ventricle that is in between both thalami and the atrium are the same level of this building. The body of the ventricle is in an upper level. So have this in mind. Anterior horn, third ventricle, and atrium are the same level of the building. Body of the ventricle is in upper level. When you see from the back, you see the posterior part of the thalamus, which is the pulvinar in both sides. You have the crura going around medially, and you have the tail of the caudate going around laterally. So this is body of the caudate, this is tail of the caudate that goes around. And you already can see here that while the fornix is going along the floor of the inferior horn, towards the floor of the inferior horn, you see that the tail of the caudate will go along the roof of the inferior horn. This beautiful dissection done by Richard. You can see here, Richard Gonzalo Parraga. Originally, he's from Bolivia. Part of his residence in Mexico, then stayed with us in Sao Paulo, both with me and Evandro. And now he's back in Bolivia. He's a very, very good neurosurgeon, famous surgeon in Bolivia nowadays. Head of the caudate, body of the caudate, and tail of the caudate. And you see that the tail of the caudate runs along the roof of the inferior horn, while the hippocampus runs along the floor of the inferior horn. Very important to have this architecture in mind. And guess where the tail of the caudates end? It ends merging with the amygdala. Of course, this is the amygdala, because this is anterior to the head of the caudate, and it's covering a little bit the head of the hippocampus, and it's covering a little bit the head of the hippocampus. This is amygdala. So you see that the caudate ends merging with the amygdala, and you already know that more medially inside here, the amygdala will end towards the globus pallidus. They get together here at the most medial aspect of an upper and medial aspect of the inferior horn. Okay, in this preparation, we did remove the corpus callosum in order to see better the ventricular cavity. Again, you can see the head of the caudate. The body of the caudate would be there. This is caudate veins, okay? And here we have the thalamus, of course. And you have all dissected the crura of the fornix, the body of the fornix, column of the fornix. I didn't emphasize until now that the body of the fornix goes mostly behind the anterior commissure, and the body of the fornix will end in the mammillary body. That's an easy dissection to do. If you dissect from the mammillary body inside the thalamus, you're going to have the mammillothalamic tract, also called tract of Vic d'Azur, which will project where? In the anterior thalamic nuclei, which are in the posterior border of foramen Monro. From the anterior thalamic nuclei, everything that comes to the thalamus will project to the cortex. From the anterior thalamic nuclei, you have most projections to the cingulum and to the orbital surface of the frontal lobe. And then from the cingulate gyrus and from here, they go to the cingulum inside here and goes, again, projects here and goes around that. What is this circuit that I'm showing you here? Mammillary bodies, mammillothalamic tract, anterior thalamic nuclei, cingulum, and then fornix again, and fornix come here. What is this? The Papez circuit, okay? That James Papez described this in 1937, and he thought that it was the emotional circuit. He called his paper the emotional circuit. But we know now that it's a limbic circuit. Everything that goes around the thalamus and the hypothalamus is called limbic. Why? Because limbic structures, the amygdala, okay, the fornix, all these structures, they were developed around the upper aspect of the brainstem, phylogenetically. And limbic in Latin means ring, means around. So all these structures that go around the upper aspect of the brainstem, namely the thalamus and the hypothalamus, okay, they are called limbic system, limbic structures, and they constitute altogether the limbic system, as we know. Okay, so this is the Papez circuit that we know that is very much related with short-term memory. But this slide is mostly to show another limbic circuit here in between the caudate and the thalamus. You can see a bunch of fibers here. These fibers are arising from the amygdala. You see here the apex of the uncus, ambient gyrus. This is a very well-defined semiannular gyrus. I'm sorry, this is the apex. This is where the ambient gyrus is. This is the upper sulcus, which is a semiannular sulcus. And anterior here we have the semiannular gyrus. The anterior choroidal artery will be coming here to get inside the inferior horn through the inferior choroidal fissure, inferior choroidal point, I'm sorry. That is the beginning of the choroidal fissure, okay? So inside this anterior half of the uncus, what do you have here? You have the amygdala. And the amygdala has a dorsal extension that always goes between the thalamus and the caudate, which is the stria terminalis. The stria terminalis is a dorsal extension, a posterior extension of the amygdala, of the centromedial amygdala, the central, which is the biggest part of the amygdala that is inside the uncus. Centromedial amygdala posterior extension, stria terminalis. And stria terminalis will end at the nucleus that it's at the base of the head of the caudate, that it's called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. And we're going to be seeing later that there's also an anterior extension, a ventral extension of the amygdala that will also end at the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. And then Leonard Heimer, very famous neuroanatomist, he lived in Charlottesville for a while and gave lectures there. We had this opportunity to do some dissections with him. And they came with this concept of extended amygdala. The amygdala, the central medial amygdala is not in a structure here. It has a dorsal extension, it has a ventral extension, and goes around the thalamus and hypothalamus. Extended amygdala. So you see that the stria terminalis is always running in between the caudate and the thalamus. But what else does run in between the caudate and the thalamus that when you get in the ventricle you see here? In this specimen, we're not seeing very well. Let me help you, where the caudate veins ends. The caudate veins are going to what vein that is here? What big vein is in the ventricle? Yes, the striothalamic vein. So when you see the striothalamic vein now, you know that underneath you have the, exactly under it, along its inferior aspect, you have the stria terminalis running. The stria terminalis that will end again at the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. Here we did cut with a knife to show that the roof of the ventricular cavity is the corpus callosum. And the light is reflecting here because you have the ependyma. Ependyma is the membrane that covers completely the ventricular cavities. So these are all fibers of the corpus callosum, and they are the roof of ventricular cavity that we're talking about. We always think about the corpus callosum along the midline. Very well defined. Anatomy again, everything that is facing down we call rostro. So this is the rostrum of corpus callosum. This is the genu, or knee of corpus callosum. This is the body, or trunk, and this is the splenium of corpus callosum. Very well defined. But the corpus callosum is our bigger commissural system that puts together both hemispheres. The corpus callosum has 200 million fibers. 200 million fibers. And these fibers, they open towards both sides. So it's difficult to understand the complexity, the three-dimensionality of the corpus callosum. I always try to say that the corpus callosum, for me, it's like a butterfly. This is the body of the butterfly. These are the wings of the butterfly, the fibers opening. But you have to figure, you have to imagine the butterfly with the wings going up and down, because you have fibers going everywhere. Very complex anatomy. They open towards both hemispheres. So again, in the midline, rostrum, genu, trunk, and splenium. Here you can see everything that you already talked about. If I'm seeing choroid plexus is along the choroid fissure. Choroid fissure is between the crudo of the fornix, upper here, and the thalamus. So if I cut here, I'm not cutting thalamus, I'm cutting the cruda, because I know that the cruda is covering the posterior part of the thalamus, the pulvinar. If I cut here, I'm cutting thalamus already. So everything in the body of the ventricle, everything that is medial to the choroid plexus is cruda, it's not thalamus. And body of the fornix also, of course. Everything that is lateral to choroid fissure, to the choroid plexus and choroid fissure, within the body of the ventricle, in the floor of the body of the ventricle, is thalamus. We call this part of the thalamus, neuroanatomists call this lamina affixa. Why lamina affixa? Because this is where the diencephalon is attached to the telencephalon. All these structures here, fornix, caudate, everything else is telencephalon. As you know, thalamus belongs to the encephalon. So this surface here is where the telencephalon is attached to the encephalon, namely to the head of the brain stem, as I already showed you, head of the brain stem. Of course, the caudate goes laterally. This is the head of the caudate, this is the body, and this is the tail of the caudate. And you see that the corpus callosum is covering all this here. But when it comes posterior to the epauvinar, within the atrium, you see that the fibers of the callosum will not go only superiorly, but will wrap they go inferiorly also. So when you talk about atrium and inferior horn, the callosal fibers, they go around both the atrium and inferior horn, because the splenium here in the midline ends, but it opens like a wing here, the splenial fibers. And they go superior to the atrium and inferior to the atrium. They go all around the atrium and the occipital horn. It's very difficult, but you have to know that. If you don't know, you don't recognize. As Professor Yasagil says, the more you know, the more you see. And the more you see, the more you know, because you have to practice this. Okay, so you have to know that when you are in the atrium, you have callosal fibers in the roof and also in the floor. They go around the atrium and around the inferior horn as well. We did talk about the fornix, and we did talk about the callosum. Very important for us neurosurgeons to understand the relationship between the fornix and the callosum. The crura of the fornix is attached to the inferior surface of the callosum. The crura of the fornix is attached to the inferior surface of the splenium of the callosum. So let's see from here now. Next slide, I'm going to be seeing from here. I'm going to see the splenium and the crura of the fornix. You see that the crura of the fornix, they are attached both sides to the splenium. This is pulvinar, this is midbrain. Aqueduct, substantia nigra, okay, peduncles. Pulvinar. Crura and crura. So this is the opening of the choroid fissure. This is opening of the choroid fissure. The space that is in between the crura and the pulvinar, the thalamus, is always choroidal fissure. But at this point, I want to emphasize that both crura are attached to the inferior surface of the splenium. And in between them, you have some fibers that are commissural fibers that come from one fornix to the other. So they are called interfornicial commissure, or they are also called hippocampal commissure, because functionally they are putting together both hippocampi. If you cut the splenium here, you're not only cutting splenial fibers, you're cutting the hypocommissural fibers as well. Commissure fibers. Now, there's a membrane in between, attached to the corpus callosum and attached to the fornix. Can anybody know what the membrane is this? This is the septum pellucidum. The septum pellucidum is attached to the rostrum, attached to the geniole, and attached to the body or trunk of the corpus callosum, and it is attached to the fornix. Where does the septum pellucidum ends? The septum pellucidum ends where the crura of the fornix gets attached to the corpus callosum, because here you don't have more space to have the septum pellucidum in between. So this point here is exactly this point here. And again, anatomy definitions. We call septum pellucidum the medial wall of the anterior horn and of the body of the ventricle. Everything that is posterior to this point is already atrium. Let me come back here to emphasize this. The septum pellucidum is the medial wall of the anterior horn and of the body of the ventricle. Everything that is posterior to this point is going to be atrium, that it's already more lateral. It's not a parasagittal space. You see that the anterior horn and the body of the ventricle, they are very much next to the midline. They are para-midline. They are just along the midline. If you come to the atrium, you see that the atrium is more lateral, posterior to the ventricle and more lateral. So the body of the ventricle ends exactly where ends its medial wall, which is the septum pellucidum. Everything that is posterior is the atrium. Please tell me when I'm speaking already 1 hour, and I'll continue later on. In this slide, you can see then, as Dr. Rotten puts, that the anterior horn has as its anterior wall the genu of the corpus callosum. Has at its floor the rostrum of the callosum. The rostrum of the callosum is the floor of the anterior horn. The genu of the callosum is the anterior wall of the anterior horn. And the head of the hippocampus, the head of the caudate, is the lateral wall of the anterior horn. When you get to the ventricle, you have to think about roof, anterior wall, medial wall, just like Dr. Rotten puts. If you come to the body of the ventricle, you have as roof thalamus, and medially body of the fornix. And as a lateral wall, you have the body of the caudate. Roof of all this, corpus callosum. If you come to the atrium, you have as its anterior wall the hippocampal tail that is ending here, and you have also the crude of the fornix that will continue with the body of the fornix. And you have the most posterior part of the thalamus, which is the pulvinar. And you have the tail of the caudate that is wrapping around here. This is all the anterior wall of the atrium. The medial wall of the atrium has again the hippocampus ending here and have this big bulge here. This big bulge corresponds to the big number of fibers that we have within the splenium, which are the forceps majors. Forceps major. Here you have forceps minor, and here you have forceps major. And this bulging of fibers here is the callosal bulb, the splenial fibers that are bulging into the ventricle, into the atrium. And more posterior, you have the inner aspect of the calcaneal fissure, which is the calcar avis. The calcaneal fissure is very deep, almost reach the ventricular cavity, transition from the atrium to the occipital horn. And you have, of course, gray matter within, because this is within the inside the calcaneal borders, calcaneal fissure borders. So the lateral wall, you have the bulb of callosum, and you have the calcar avis. Again, here, other specimen, you have the bulb of callosum, and you have the calcar avis. Anterior wall of the atrium, tail of the caudate, pulvinar, the crude of the fornix. Medial wall, you have the hippocampal tail, and then you have bulb of callosum, then you have calcar avis. And when you look at the floor of the atrium, you have always a very constant shape here, triangular shape, and very flat. This is called collateral trigon. Why collateral trigon? Because it's lying just superior to the collateral sulcus that I told you about. Collateral sulcus is a very long sulcus that comes almost from the occipital pole and almost reaches the temporal pole. And it goes just underneath here. So this is collateral trigon. So collateral trigon corresponds to the floor of the atrium. Now, if we go more anterior, what are we going to be seeing? You see, this is another specimen. You can see, again, very flat triangular area here, which is the collateral trigon. Now, when you go more anterior, it becomes round. It becomes a prominence. It belongs to what we call collateral eminence. So this is floor of the atrium and floor of the occipital horn. Always understand the occipital horn as a posterior continuation of the atrium. Now here, we have the floor of the inferior horn. The floor of the inferior horn. Floor of the inferior horn has what? Medially, you have the hippocampus itself. Hippocampus. And laterally, what do you have? Collateral eminence. So collateral trigon, roof, floor of the atrium, continues anteriorly as the floor of the inferior horn, but becomes an eminence, becomes a prominence. So it's collateral eminence. So we talk about all the structures that are related with the ventricles, are the deep structures. We didn't talk yet about what is in between here and what is covering this very important roof here that we go through in very, very common surgical cases. What do we have in between? You see here the caudate, you're seeing here the thalamus, and you're seeing here, what you're seeing here? Lentiform nucleus or lenticular nucleus, the putamen. Lentiform nucleus is the putamen plus the globus pallidus. And you're seeing that the putamen, the lentiform nucleus, has an internal capsule and has an external capsule. When you call about internal capsule fibers, we're talking, this is the internal capsule of the lentiform nucleus. And it has 5 parts: an anterior limb, a genu, a posterior limb, a retrolentiform, and a sublentiform. 5 parts. We're not going along what fibers are here in order to save time, but understand that the internal capsule is the internal capsule of the lentiform nucleus, anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, retrolentiform, and sublentiform. And the external capsule is just this anterior and lateral part here that are the fibers that are constituting the external capsule of the lentiform nucleus. And of course, this capsule will continue here laterally. Now, what is very interesting is that all the structures I'm talking about, they constitute a very well-defined block, that Dr. Rotem called the central core of the brain. Eduardo is going to give a specific talk about this because this was his project during a whole year there. But at this point, I want to emphasize that the anterior, this central core of the brain has as its lateral wall the insula, the cortex of the insula, and medial wall, the surface of the ventricle here, where you have the head of the caudate, the body of the caudate, and the thalamus. And you see that the anterior half of the central core of the brain is very much related to the head of the hippocampal, head of the caudate. And the posterior half is related with the thalamus, and it's related with the body of the caudate. And in between you have, of course, the foramen Monroe. Oi? Já cheguei no horário? Okay, let me end just emphasizing here the internal capsule, okay? And you have this lentiform nucleus, and you have the internal capsule fibers coming here, all the 5 components, and you see that they go posteriorly towards the peduncular area, towards the peduncle. Now again, anatomy definitions. Internal capsule is the internal capsule of the lentiform nucleus that is laying here. Everything that is above, that is superior to this limit of the lentiform nucleus is corona radiata or centrosemiovalle. Are the same fibers, of course, but it's a different concept. This is centrosemiovalle. This is internal capsule. When they come inferior to the lentiform nucleus, they become the peduncular fibers. Okay, I think I'm going to be talking about this part later on, after a break here and after the second lecture. Thank you very much.